Welcome to the next installment of Prespero's War Stories, Tales from the Front Lines of Procurement. I am Matt Searing, COO of Prespero, and I'm here today with my business partner, Don Searing, CEO of Prespero. Today's question or topic is tell us about the worst RFP project failure you have seen.
Yeah, and again, just from a contextual standpoint, I've been working in solution development and consulting in the health insurance space for the past almost 20 years, and been doing RFP responses and looking for kind of finding partners for our solutions and things like that. So I think when we start talking about the worst RFP failure that I've been involved in, it's probably a project from a few years back. Was a medium-sized health insurer, really with some older technology, but some idea of they really needed to up their game and move themselves into the kind of current technology. They wanted some self-service capabilities. They wanted for a couple of their different market segments. And it was a rather odd RFP that kicked off to start with, because it was clear from the way they put the RFPs together that there were a couple RFPs, and they didn't realize that there were solutions that could solve all of those RFPs in one package. Right, so you had an RFP for one part of what we did, and another RFP for another part of what we did, and our competitors and us have essentially the same capabilities. And so anyone who'd known about the industry and how these things tended to work would have known that like these should have been put together, and you could find a solution that would do everything that they wanted, which is fine, because I don't think every customer fully understands the technology. They were a little bit behind anyway. So that was not unexpected. I see that a lot in RFPs where people aren't quite sure where the system boundaries tend to be, where the solutions that are out there, how they tend to sit and interact with other systems. And especially in the health insurance world, there's a lot of pieces that have to kind of fit together in a puzzle. So I think that what was interesting was we started doing this RFP and started communicating, through our questions and stuff. And we realized that actually there was a rather large consulting company that was engaged already doing the vendor selection. And so, while I could say, I can understand a carrier's business people not being fully up to speed with what was in the marketplace. They had hired consultants to help them figure that out. And the consultants apparently didn't know what was in the marketplace either. And that should have been our first red flag, that we were dealing with folks that were not 100% kind of dialed into the health insurer space and the what we were doing with our products, or what people needed. And so we responded to the RFP, and we kind of mentioned that our one product satisfies all three of your RFPs that you have out. And they were genuinely shocked that this was there, and they were shocked because it wasn't just us; it was us and our competitors saying, "Yeah, we can do all of these." So it was very interesting to kick off. And so we went down, we answered the questions, we made the finalist list. We went down, did our day-long presentation. We flew our CEO in, and everybody, sat down with their top leadership, and we talked about, how we like to partner with people. And we dove into building out this kind of starting the project. So we won the RFP. And they really loved that we had one product that could do all these things. And we said, okay, cool. This should be a fairly straightforward implementation. We went down, we did our kickoff and our discovery, where we go and really dig in, and prioritized a couple phases to roll out all the capabilities that they wanted. But what was odd was, even after the vendor selection was done, the consulting company didn't disappear. So they kind of stayed engaged, and which is a bit odd, because if you're hiring somebody to do a vendor selection, you'd think, oh, once the vendor's selected, they help with the contracting stuff, and then they peel off. And what ended up happening is either however they set this contract up or whatever, the vendor selecting entity was going to stay on and be the master implementing project manager. And that makes sense if when they were doing 3 RFPs and they needed one overall people to kind of make sure that all the pieces work together. But in the end, they all came into one solution, and you didn't need that, right? We were just putting one thing in place and would do all of these things. But they had already engaged this company. So this company just became their consultants just became the project managers that sat there and watched what we were doing. And it was a very awkward situation because they had been, like most vendor selectors, part of their job is to work with the vendors and make sure that the vendors have positioned themselves correctly. And as I mentioned, they didn't really understand the market that we were in the market segment. And so we were just kind of fighting with them on certain things. And, when they were hired to kind of oversee the process, they got really heavily involved in the project management, more so than I think we all thought. And so while we were building up our, doing our discovery, putting together our implementation plan, they kind of inserted themselves as the communications conduit between the customer and ourselves. And so we stopped meeting with the customers once we had all the requirements. We started only meeting with the consultants, and we were giving them our implementation plan. And this went on for about 4 to 6 weeks. We were starting to get into development, starting to get, kind of do a couple of the customizations, start to configure the site. And we were going to go live in probably another few months after that. But we got a call from their vice president, the company's vice president, saying, "Hey, we want you guys to come back down and meet with us about the project plan and just the prioritization. We just want to make sure that we're all on the same page." And so a bunch of the leadership, including myself, we flew down and we met with the customer, and they were like, "Yeah, we're done." And we're like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, "Yeah, well, we've been here patiently for 6 to 8 weeks. We've been waiting. You guys have never delivered a plan to us, a project plan. You've never delivered any kind of, just even an outline of what the heck you guys are doing. Your team's just working through this, and we're not involved in it at all." And I'm like, "I've seen the project plan." And I'm like, I pull it up on my machine. I'm like, "This project plan, we sent this over 6 weeks ago, right after discovery." And they're like, "We've never seen it." And I'm like, "We sent it." And so I'm talking with our team, like, "Where did we send this, guys?" And they're like, "Oh, we sent it to the project management consultant / vendor selection consultant."
Okay.
And they've been reviewing it for 6 weeks.
Oh.
And they didn't want to deliver it to the customer because they didn't necessarily approve of it yet for some reason. And so what happened is we were moving forward we had provided a plan. We were moving into implementation, and we had no idea until we were called down there that we were basically fired at that point, that the project ended. And it was like, where did this come from? And, to find out that the project management firm had kind of interjected itself and had kind of been blocking communications from us to our client was kind of news to us. And the funny thing is that in the meeting we had, the client's vice president turned and said, "Hey, did they give that to you 6 weeks ago?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, we've been reviewing it for 6 weeks. We got it weeks ago." And he's like, "I've asked you repeatedly, did you have the plan?" And they said, "Well, we didn't feel it was up to snuff, and we were trying to kind of make some changes." And like, "But we gave you a plan, right? And you guys didn't communicate it on."
Huh.
And so what happened is we had already kicked off. We'd already gotten our initial payment. They had paid this vendor selection company, which turns out, as all this kind of worked itself out, we found out they paid the vendor selection company more money to do the vendor selection and the project management than they paid us to do they were going to pay us to do the full implementation. So it was like a factor of 2. So we were a couple $1 million for implementation. They were paying the vendor selector like $4 million, which made no sense to us because they had literally gotten really bad advice. It essentially created a team that just became a logjam and prevented the communications from happening. So it was one of those things where we were really excited. We had a great fitting product. It was for us, it was our sweet spot for the right size customer. We weren't some of the larger companies. You have to work through 15 departments. This was small enough that we were dealing right with the decision makers, and we were like, this is going to be an easy implementation. They didn't want too much custom, and we were just going to snap this one out and be great. And it went from, a great feeling for winning the RFP to about 6 weeks later, we lost the whole business and all the other phases and stuff. And in the end, we watched everyone involved in this project. They got rid of the consulting company. They got fired. We got fired. Frankly, a lot of the decision makers on the team that we were working on got demoted or fired. And this whole project, because this was what the CEO had kind of laid out, is that we're going to bring ourselves into the future, provide a lot of self-service and customer experience enhancements. And it just fell apart.
Imploded.
Totally fell apart. And everyone got a black eye out of it. And, I look at this and this has informed so much of what we've done in our platform, right? That just on how could we have avoided this? How could we, or somebody, sit in the middle of this and help the vendor and the buyer actually communicate better? And that's the part that, it is amazing, because, there's a couple of spots in here where things came off the rails. And I think if there had been a better tool or platform for them, it wouldn't have. From the very beginning of saying, I'm a business user, like, what's out there? What kind of tools should I be looking for? Yeah. Are there tools? And maybe not immediately reach out to a very expensive name brand consulting firm that's notorious for providing, fresh out of college kids on these projects. How could they have known better what was available in the marketplace? And if they had actually had a tool like Prespero, where they could look and they could see the kinds of architectural systems the systems they may need based on their architecture, they could see, who the right vendors were in that space. I think that whole process would have kicked off a little bit better. They wouldn't have spent all the money they spent on the vendor selector.
Yeah.
And I think, part of that, they spent so much money that was like, when they did the selection and it went from 3 RFPs to 1, I want to say, I have a feeling that the customer, the client, felt that they didn't get their money's worth, right? That we spend all this money and it turns out there was just one product that did all these 3 things.
Yeah.
We didn't need to spend all that. And I think part of that was then, hey, well, then we'll stay on and we'll help you manage the project implementation. And I think that mistake led into the second mistake of including a team of people into a process that they weren't expecting to be in and that they weren't prepared to be in. And then from our standpoint, just we were moving forward as if everything was fine. Talking to our implementation team, they had a great discovery. We got all the good information we needed. We had everything we needed to start doing the implementation. Implementation was moving forward. We provided the plan. We didn't know from our project team that they weren't talking to the client anymore. And that was something that we missed that. Yeah. And I think that part of the thing where, when we start talking about, as we talk about the Prespero process being not just the initiation of the RFP and the execution of it, but then how do you get the implementation to work? And that feedback loop that we've built in is specifically designed to address this, where, if we had a sentiment analysis running, looking at what our team and what we would say, saying, hey, the project's going great. Everything, we got everything we need. We're really going, we're starting to really kick it in and start cooking on that project. And we would have seen that the client, our expectations were going this way. Their sentiment was going this way, where they were getting angry because they'd never seen anything from us. If we had a chart, for example, tracking that sentiment on a week by week basis, we would have seen we were starting to really diverge. And that would have been a huge red flag to say, hang on a second, you guys think the project's going great. I'm looking at the customer feedback here and it's not going well. So let's sit down and have that conversation. And maybe we would have surfaced the fact that there was a huge communications gap happening. And that, and that kind of would have been much more obvious for us. So that's kind of when I look back at this, this project itself really had a bad start and a bad finish. And the intermediate part of actually responding to the RFP, doing the finalists, doing the contract, that was fairly simple. But this is why it's important you go from A to Z in that process and not just focus on the RFP part, but look at how do you start? How do you find the right solutions? How do you execute that RFP? Find the right vendor and then complete the project with that vendor.
Excellent. So on the communication side of it, Prespero's platform going to prevent that diversion so there will be notifications?
Yeah. So, again, when we built into the process, right, the 5 steps from the initiation of the project all the way then through the execution. And for our standpoint, if you look at other RFP projects and other RFP software, it stops when you've selected the vendor and now you go into contracting, right? And the process stops. And for us, if we've been using even one of our other competitors, right, the RFP probably would have been okay. It would have had 3 RFPs in an electronic RFP system. We would have answered it very similarly, and they would have chosen us. And then it would not have helped. Those other kind of systems would not have helped us help them kind of bring that to a actual implementation. And I think that's where we differ, because we have steps in our process and tools in our product that allow us to track the project after we sign the contract, right? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to say, just getting to the contract that's not the end, that's the middle, right?
Yeah.
Actually getting the working piece of software in place and the solution that the business needed, that is the end of the project.
Tracking
that's
satisfaction.
When the feedback needs to happen. So I think tracking the sentiment, sending out implementation questionnaires every week, just a really simple survey, just to get the pulse of the project of all the different stakeholders. And then, when you start to diverge like that, we would have thrown an error, right? That would have been a notification to the vendor and to the buyer. Hey, we're diverging, right? They think everything's fine. You guys think everything's bad. There's a huge gap. And then that red flags would have gone up in our system, and that would have been a notification that we would have sent.
Well, excellent. Well, I appreciate your time today, and tune in to our next installment of Prespero's War Stories. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Ben.